All right, I think we should be live. All right, cool. So, welcome. If you're again somehow stumbling upon this randomly for the first time, not knowing who I am, my name is Dennis Misigoy, Libertarian running for U.S. Senate seat here in Florida in the November 2022 election. This is my first time doing one of these live streams a bit later in the day. So forgive me, I'm a little thrown off my normal routines. Not that this is ever, I guess, totally normal. Nothing about all this sort of thing is normal. But, you know, it is one of those means and ways that I try to use to reach out and communicate with folks and see if I can engage people in a little bit different way than just text on a screen or just having a page out there that you really have no reason to go to. So it's what I'm doing. It's what I'm trying to be here on. Whether you're on live or watching this later, to talk a little bit about some of the things that matter and hopefully give you an indication of why it's so important, why I find it necessary to run, and why I hope that you will get behind and support me in what I'm doing in whatever way that you can. So that's the goal. So I think there's a lot of stuff I haven't gotten on streaming in a week, and even if being still on social media, it's not the same thing. Some of the interesting things talking about and conversations that I've been in or just had thoughts about over the last week or so. One of those is, because it also goes to something I talked about, or at least something that's part of my platform, even if not exactly in this particular area, but in terms of the principle, and that has to do with the Ghislaine Maxwell trial, criminal proceedings. One of the interesting things is the contrast between that and the Kyle Rittenhouse case, which was widely televised. Obviously, people had a real clear understanding of what was going on, a lot of information out there. Very much unlike that, we have these federal criminal courts where it's not only not televised, but it's incredibly cumbersome for anyone who's trying to get information out from the courtroom. They basically have to be sitting there taking notes by hand, go outside, leave the courtroom, not just leave the courtroom, leave the building so they can get their phone back, to then go and send that information. And essentially, if you wanted to really track everything, you'd have to have like a rotation of people where one goes in, one comes out, constantly to be able to try to track all this information, unless you're going to have if you're going to try to get anything close to real time, I should say. Otherwise, you're going to have somebody taking notes for the entire day and then trying to give you, just what tiny snippet they can fit in there. There's been a few Twitter accounts that have been, starting with one main one and then quickly getting banned for very interesting reasons but they essentially have done nothing but cover this case. And it's very interesting to see how that's gone. In particular, there was an offending tweet, which was where they noted that it appeared, based on what was shown in the photos and the evidence, that a lot of the computer devices, the hard drives and such, that contained some of the stuff that the FBI had investigated, based on the tags and everything that were there, it appeared that not only had it been brought in for this particular investigation, but it looked, what they were able to observe made it appear as though the evidence had actually been collected and documented by the FBI prior to this case, prior to being seized for this case. So it's interesting that something which the FBI would have already seized in the past and which contained such damning evidence related to what we know about with this case, that would have been returned afterwards. That does seem a little strange to most people. So, but getting back to my main point about this is the fact that the federal courts, just as I try to give the same sort of grief to other aspects of the federal government, the federal bureaucracies, all of our alphabet soup agencies that engage in all sort of nefarious activity that people would never approve of or support if they knew it was happening. We can talk about the whole experiments that the NIAID was funding related to where the the whole business with the beagles being having their heads locked in cages, with, I forget what was the type of insect, but essentially having their heads eaten alive after being drugged. Some really bizarre and gruesome stuff that most people, if you gave them a choice of whether or not you wanted to give your tax dollars to pay for this stuff, most people would unequivocally and absolutely say, no way. So the question is, why, if it's stuff like this, that why is it when it's stuff like this that our money's getting spent here? So when we ask that question and when we consider it, part of it is just the fact that most people don't know what's going on, obviously. That only came to light recently because of documents coming through Freedom of Information Act, but that is a cumbersome process. This also goes to the case with Julian Assange. For anyone who missed, over the last week, there was a ruling about him being able to be extradited to the U.S., and again, this is also reflective of this big problem here, and the problem has to do, obviously, with transparency. We, as the American taxpayer, pay for a government that does all of this stuff in the shadows and keeping secrets, and in particular, in this case, we're talking just about even just court proceedings. We pay for this court system. It is at least supposed to be representing us, enforcing laws that are, again, it's supposed to, all of the lofty rhetoric that we hear about as we grow up and we learn about government in the U.S., by the people, for the people, etc. All of that is quite thrown in our face, or just thrown out the window, perhaps, when you talk about a federal court proceeding that you really have no insight into, and more particularly in this case also, where you have the Constitution, which requires criminal proceedings to be public. I mean, that's one of those guarantees. And the rationale that they used for this is basically that even before television and all this stuff, that these were still considered public hearings. And that may be true, but it goes to a little bit of the sense of whether government does the absolute minimum or actually does the best it can in terms of the simplest things. And I don't even mean like we're going to spend a bunch of money to try to do something amazing for people. I just mean, within reason, don't create unnecessary impediments. And let me give you the example of what I'm talking about. When I served on the district board in my old community development district back in Miami-Dade County, going up until the beginning of this year, the first 2 years that I was serving there, the meetings that we had were in the middle of work days at 11:30 in the morning on a weekday, 20 to 30 miles outside of the district. Now, sure, if somebody wanted to do it, they could do it. They could get out there. They could make it out there. It wasn't closed off to the public or anything, but it was very cumbersome. It was very difficult. It was unnecessarily difficult. And it was one of the things that I made it a point to do. And sure, you could read meeting minutes later after the fact, a couple months later when they were published after being approved in a subsequent meeting. But what we did, one of the first things I did once we had turnover in the board after the midterm elections in 2018 was change that meeting schedule. Meetings were moved into the evening, 7:30. They were moved to a location within a couple miles of the district. We didn't have any place within the district as a proper meeting location because it's all residential, but we got something within reason. And people don't always come every day. People didn't come to every meeting, excuse me. We didn't have full attendance ever. But, I see full attendance of the public. The board was there most of the time. But you make it accessible to people. If you're going to say we're going to have these meetings be public, well, you don't have them be public, again, 30, 40 miles away from the district in some place and time where it's almost impossible for working people to be able to get out there and have an easy time getting out there. Where you're going to demand these kind of sacrifices of them unnecessarily. And the same thing is here. Technology today allows us to really make these things accessible, so why not allow them to be accessible? There's no good reason other than you really don't want people seeing it. That's the only reason. And it's on us to take a stand and say that that's just not acceptable. And so you need to change the people who've perpetuated the system that continues it along this path. And that's certainly, I think, appropriate action that a legislator could take. It goes to the same sort of thing, though, of wanting this kind of transparency and openness in government in general, and the courts are part of the government. It's not something I necessarily think about all the time in terms of this discussion, but I think it's worth having because how can we hold any aspect of our government accountable for what it does if we don't know what it's doing? If we don't know what kind of, whether they are covering up for some heinous, horrible crimes, or whether they're, got some kind of kangaroo court going on where they're just drumming up charges and punishing people who really don't deserve it. Both happen, and but if we don't see it, if we don't know about it, it becomes real hard for us as a people to hold them accountable and try to get something better out of this. So, and again, I guess really along those lines, and I think that's going to be the theme of this episode is all of this. As I mentioned, the Assange, and I think it's interesting to kind of contrast what's going on with Julian Assange being extradited, most likely, and what he's in trouble for, again, which is publishing the truth. It seems crazy to think that you have a government which is taking our money, doing all sort of often nefarious things, but it lies to us and it keeps secrets from us. And on the other side of this equation, we have a guy who exposed the secrets and told the truth. He's the one who's up to getting punished. It seems really obvious to me when you compare those two, lies and secrets, tell the truth and expose the secrets. It seems really obvious to me which one is the good guys in that thing, in that scenario. And it is, there's not enough we can say about it. And recognizing this, I am going to at least recognize this last question from Joe, which is how can we help? The easiest and most immediate one, I'm going to put right up here, which is the URL. If you can contribute what you can. None of this is, no part of this is free. We got to be able to reach people. We got to be on the ballot to make sure that they got to even have a choice. So this is one of the things. If you can't necessarily do that per se, then you can always. The link is also in the description of the video. However, taking on from that, if you don't think that's something you can commit to, even in a modest amount, certainly I could use some help with folks to be able to reach out. I was had a couple training calls earlier this week for, I guess if I count Sunday as the beginning of the week, to kind of get some stuff started with reaching out to folks across the state, doing some simple phone calling, but whatever you can do. Also on the website, there's a get involved. I think it's on every page on here. Now I'm second guessing myself, but yes, no. Get involved is up on the bar at the top on the little navigation bar. If you go to the website as well, you can go there and get involved there. If you can, let me know what you can do. The limit a person can contribute to the campaign. So according to FEC regulations, the maximum individual contribution per election cycle is $2,900 for this time. So I definitely won't ask more of anyone than $2,900. Obviously, anyone, if you can contribute less than that, if you can't contribute that much, obviously, I wouldn't say don't contribute. That's the max of what it is. And that's actually interestingly broken up because you can do that per primary election and per the general election. I haven't quite researched to say if there's really restrictions to say can you collect a donation for the later, for the general, before the actual primary dates, which I believe for us here in Florida will be in August. That's when they were the last time I was in terms of congressional and Senate primary. Let me see. And obviously we're not likely to have a primary among libertarians unless I get surprised in the next little bit. But honestly, I would rather try to work with anyone, collaborate with any other libertarian who thought that they wanted to do this and come to an understanding. I wouldn't want to have a runoff with somebody else, or excuse me, a primary against another Libertarian, kind of diverting resources from having somebody out there against the establishment candidates. So, yeah, we had. Oh yeah, no, August. I was reading that. I was reading that as a different word, or more particularly a name. But anyway, but yeah, so contributions are good, and obviously, if you really wanted to contribute the max, and you really felt you needed to contribute more, if you really felt an obligation to do so, you could also, in the name of, you could, if you have a close family member, spouse, or whatnot, who didn't have a real issue with you using their name, you could certainly make a contribution on their behalf as well, because we have to have kind of people's information for FEC reporting purposes. But the form is pretty succinct, I think, the one that's on the website. Obviously, if you're going to donate a higher amount, it's a little bit better if you send a check rather than that, just because, processing fees get bigger, and depending upon the amount of the contribution. So where was I? So that's that. Obviously, if you just send a check, then it's just the check and it gets processed. It takes a little longer, but it gets here. Or if you're at an event where I'm actually going to be at, that'll be good. I'm going to see possibly a couple things in January, but I need to nail a couple of things down, verify with some other family stuff going on to make sure I can get out a couple different places. So, circling back to the issues over here, another one which caught my eye, and again in sort of contrast to everything that's going on, I'm trying to look at when exactly did this story hit, because it was, actually see this post, this actually is posted by WikiLeaks, where we got some CIA files that came out, which showed that they have instances of CIA staffers committing sex crimes involving children, and no prosecution, no one held accountable. And I think it's really important for people to understand that there really is no limit to how egregious and awful of a crime people in government will allow others in government to get away with in the, what's the word I'm looking for? And not even just within the context of their duties, but it really is strangely unusual, and it almost has to be really egregious. I guess a good example would be the George Floyd murder, Derek Chauvin. If that wasn't on camera, if that wasn't on video out in public, I think there's a pretty solid chance that there wouldn't have been anything to really come of it in terms of criminal charges, in terms of, certainly not in terms of civil penalties. I don't think anything would have come of it if there wasn't video of it. If it was purely eyewitnesses, he said, she said, yeah, and lawmakers definitely aren't held to account. But unfortunately, or well, not for the criminal activity usually, but also I'd say, and well, let me backtrack, because in kind of getting a couple of those different tangents, I think it's one of the things I think was really the missed opportunity of the last decade's worth of debate over police violence and excessive force and everything that's going on. One of the things I used to hear, I don't hear it very much anymore, but one of the things I used to hear a lot was from law enforcement and from people defending law enforcement. One of the things they used to say was, well, they don't make the laws, they just enforce them. And I think it's a tremendous missed opportunity that we never, as a larger society, there was never a shift to then ask the question, well, who did make these laws? And why did they make such awful laws that created the conditions for these, that created the conditions for everything we're seeing here, for all these terrible interactions that are creating so much harm, that are all these bad interactions. And with that, we have a question about what's one law you think should be repealed. Goodness gracious. Federal Reserve Act, Controlled Substances Act, 94 Crime Bill. We can go lots of different ways. I don't know if I'd upset any other libertarians by saying Immigration Act of 1924 and some others. So there's quite a lot of opportunities. Probably pretty much every federal immigration law, to be perfectly honest with you. But if you're asking me one law, that's a little bit harder. I guess we'll go with Federal Reserve Act. That's a simple one. We can just get rid of the Fed. That'll help a lot in terms of the money. It won't help with all this stuff, but that's an important step because obviously, as we know, the impact that money's having on everyone's life. I forget what was the most recent number I heard in terms of inflation hitting 6%, or is it passing that already here? It's baffling to see the way that this is being talked about, and again, it's a question of how much are people willing to wake up, and maybe that's something for me and every other libertarian to really circle back and hammer down on this Federal Reserve issue, because I think most of us remember before we got involved in this not understanding the Federal Reserve and whatever it was that got you turned on to that. It is important for more people to hear it, because once you hear it and you kind of understand what's going on, it really is so egregious, it is so awful, and it's important for as many people as possible to know it, because if they don't know it, how can you be outraged about something and you don't even know what's happening? So, but that again goes for being outraged about truly outrageous things like government agents, CIA staffers, or whoever getting away again with literally one of the worst possible crimes we can imagine. One of the things where there's almost universal agreement that people who do this, a special place in hell needs to be reserved for them, and it's just some of the absolute worst, which is, again, sex crimes against children. And the fact that, again, we're not just talking about where somebody did it and they kind of got away from the law for a little while, or they were able to, or for one reason or another, they were able to kind of game the system and get away for a little while. But this is something completely different. This is not someone evading authorities. This is the authorities. This is the people. We're paying for these people, and we're trusting them to do something on our behalf as a part of the government of this country, and we have a certain image that's partly given to us by the media, obviously partly fed by the government itself, but of these people as heroes, or they're fighting for a country, they're doing good work for it, they're making these big sacrifices, and instead we find out, and maybe not to say in a universal sense, but the fact is, it is happening. It is happening, it has happened, and it will probably continue to happen because there's no accountability for it. And that's the part that should be unacceptable to everyone. But the question is, what are you going to do about it? Because we don't have Congress members coming up and doing something about it. We don't have senators doing something about it who have the power, who have the subpoena power, and who control the funding for agencies like this. They can hold them accountable, and they can drag them out over the coals. But they're not the ones who revealed this. They're not the ones who found out about this and put this out for everybody to read, let people know about it. Who was it? It's WikiLeaks over here. I mean, people have to go through, or it's other parts of the media, whoever it is. Who should it be? Shouldn't it be those folks that we're electing to represent us, to hold these people who are working for us? They're getting paid through our tax dollars to hold them accountable. They're not. And that's part of the difference. Because Congress is a part of it. The question is, why isn't Congress doing something about the corruption? Well, Congress is part of the corruption. Congress is at the heart of it. That's really the thing, and that's part of what I want to always impress upon everyone, and why I think it's so important to change the folks here. I was having a conversation with a gentleman earlier today who had sent a message over through the website, and he really wanted to emphasize, he's a big believer that one of the things we really need is term limits. Now, I'm not as much of a, even though term limits is a part of the Libertarian Party platform, I'm sort of reticent to jump really heavy on the term limits train, just because I don't think it's a silver bullet. Now, I do think there's something to be said about folks who are just perpetually in government, and particularly within the same spot. These deeply entrenched folks, the Pelosi's, the Schumers, the Charlie Rangel. We used to have Bill Nelson down here just up until a few years ago, and heck, look at the president, Joe Biden. I mean, between the time he was in the Senate, was a vice president, and now president, I think he's been in Washington, D.C. in our federal government for something close to 20% of American history. It's quite absurd if you stop and think about it, but yeah, this guy's been there for almost a fifth of the country's history. So, so there's something to be said about maybe not allowing people to do that. I can understand why that's an appealing thing, but at the end of the day, we as the voters are the ones who need to be holding those folks accountable, not allowing them to continue on. But again, a big part of that is us having the awareness of what they're doing. And I think it's really important for, I can't fire, as a private citizen, as a voter, I can't fire the CIA director or any of the supervisors who allowed this thing that I'm talking about to happen. I don't have the ability to do it. I have no direct path to do it. But now that stuff like this is out here, it's incumbent upon our elected officials to do something about it. Or they just rubber stamp it and they allow it, and then you can treat them as though they're responsible as well, because they're, again, passing the buck. They're allowing it to happen. They have the ability to take action, as does our chief executive, but they don't, and they won't. So the question is just for us, how okay with that are we? I'm not okay with it at all. That's why I'm doing this. Our Congress members not paid enough. No. Are not paid enough. I'm trying to figure out how I answer that question properly. They are paid enough, and probably more than enough. It's a really weird situation where you have, and it's really so bizarre, where you have a situation where any person working who is not the owner of a company can decide to pay themselves more with other people's money. That's pretty unique, but that is the circumstances of Congress, and it really doesn't make sense, but it is what happens, which is strange, and again, something else where we should be kick up a fuss about. Something I've had ideas about in the past, not necessarily as a fleshed out policy proposal, but one thing I think would be great, in the same vein as what we do. It's over $170,000 a year currently, but one of the things I thought would be maybe a nice way, because again, aren't they supposed to be working for us? This is really sort of on its head, the fact that they can pay themselves more of our money when they decide to, rather than us deciding. So one of the things I thought would be nice, certainly there would be a cost incurred, because you'd have to hold some sort of elections in between, or something along those lines. But basically in the same vein as the idea of allowing taxpayers to say, well, I want to give my tax dollars to go to this, but not to that. I approve of these things, but not this kind of spending. My tax dollars going to that. In the same vein as that, I think something that'd be real nice would be that if we, the voters in a particular district, were guaranteed control over the salaries of our elected representatives. So that could be done in a few different ways. Obviously, since states and local governments, counties and municipalities run elections, they would have a little bit of leeway in terms of how to do this. But maybe if you wanted to create really a federal framework for doing this, you could have us essentially allow people on off election years, so on the odd numbered years for Congress folks, and then we figure out whatever we do for the Senate somewhere in between their term as well. Basically allow the voters in that state to either reward them with a raise, allow their wage to remain the same, or to give them a pay cut. Voters should have all three options at a bare minimum. And there's a lot of ways you can do this. You can just give them for any of us here in Florida who went through some of the standardized testing back in the day, if you remember like those bubble sheets where you did the bubble in the number for the FCAT, when you it wasn't multiple choice, but when you had to like put in the number in the bubble sheet, something like that, where folks could just put in the number, and whatever the average of what every voter in that district thought that the representative should be paid, that would just be, they would just average that number, and that would be the person's salary. It'd be something to it. There's a question from Brian about what about the states paying the salary instead of the federal government. I'm not averse to that. At the end of the day, it's still money coming from the taxpayer, and I think I would like the taxpayer, if they're electing them, they're the ones responsible for assessing the job. But I'm not totally averse to whether the money comes from federal taxes or state taxes. There's something to it where you could say, in particular, again, because under the Constitution, the Congress controls federal spending, but that also means their own wage. So it is really a conflict of interest. So whatever we do, whether it goes through states and you have other agency that oversees it individually within the states, or whether it we find some other mechanism, still run through the states and local governments, because they're the ones who figure this out, working with the elections and setting up the ballots and everything, if it goes that route. But some kind of mechanism where somebody else decides what the wages are, because it is absolutely bonkers that anybody can say that they're going to take somebody else's money, and I get to vote. Me and all the people I'm working with, we get to vote on raising our own wage. It makes absolutely no sense, and it defies the conventions of any entity that has to pay wages under the constraints of reality, where you don't get to print the money, you don't get to take the money from other people, and you actually have to produce something. So it is pretty much any of these alternatives would be better than what we're currently seeing, which and have had in place for a very long time, and we've seen where it's gotten us. We've got a Congress and Senate, the U.S. House and the U.S. Senate, full of people who are unaccountable, getting fat, and not just off the salary, because remember, the salary is really just a baseline for these guys. Almost all of them have, due to their influence, are able to generate alternative income streams. Some a little more legitimate than others, obviously, but that is what it is. But even if they had nothing but their salaries as elected officials, they would still, none of them would be suffering. None of them are struggling to get by. So it's important for us, again, to kind of rectify that and see if we can find ways. I mean, we've got a few proposals that we just thrown out over here, but something that kind of separates that and gets that power to their hand, because it makes no sense. And certainly not for these people who are, again, they get to decide how much they get paid, and people just keep reelecting them, because people, for various reasons, I guess we can say, biggest of which is the tribalism, the two-party system. Folks have been generally committed to believing that they have to vote Republican or Democrat, and if they happen to be in one of these these districts that lean heavily one way, I mean, it's basically as long as they want to stay there. So Nancy Pelosi just gets elected and gets elected and gets elected and gets elected, and continues on in that position, continues collecting those checks. And if any of you followed on Twitter, there was another account that got banned recently, nonsensically, is one that had been tracking Nancy Pelosi's stock portfolio because apparently she's like one of the greatest investors of all time, strangely successful since her time in Congress. So, but apparently they got banned. I don't recall what the reason was, but it's obviously something quite illegitimate, as we can tell, because based on the fact that all that account was posting was basically what trades and stuff she was making, and kind of exposing the fact that again, someone who clearly is going to have access to a lot of extra information is being so successful. So I've talked at length about everything these people are, well, not everything, I've barely scratched the surface in that respect, but some of these awful things, dealing with transparency and all of these terrible activities that people are in our government are engaged in. Yeah, very lucky, incredibly. Like I was talking about the case over here with the CIA agents engaged in this stuff, and also some of the, we don't necessarily know for sure, but some of what we've heard about in terms of intelligence connections with Epstein and Maxwell, at least what had been said when Alexander Acosta had given Epstein the deal a decade or so ago, was that one of the things he had been told was that he was involved with Israeli intelligence. So again, this whole idea of government agents, excuse me, my throat's gotten dry. I keep on talking and I keep on not stopping to take a sip. So give me one sec. I'm gonna wrap this up, but we have all these elements within our federal government that are engaged in activities that we should not be shy about calling evil, and I really want to make sure that we don't. It's cliche in the general sense. We always talk about voting for the lesser of two evils, but I think there's a real need to emphasize when we talk about sex crimes with children by federal employees and no accountability, nothing is done to them. We're not even talking about people being fired, disciplined, whatever, much less criminally charged the way they should be. This is what we're talking about. We're talking about evil stuff when we talk about the wars, when we talk about all this sort of collusion, when we talk about the drug war being waged on American soil, when we talk about all of these things, or we talk about it's important to remember that all of this is made possible by the folks who are in elected office. They are not powerless with this. They control the money that goes behind us. They can end these things. They have a real opportunity to do that, but they don't want to because they're part of this system. And the only way this changes is if they are changed. And I don't mean we are going to convince them. We're going to make them have a change of heart. That's not... they may, and it'd be great if they did. It would be great if all of them woke up tomorrow and decided they wanted to turn over a new leaf, but I'm not going to hold my breath on that. That's why I filed a run, and that's why I need as many of you guys to give whatever support you guys can so that we can make this happen. I think every Floridian and really every American deserves an alternative to what we're seeing. And it's on those of us who can to try to step up, to try to make something happen. And that's what I ask for from you guys, and hope you guys will see fit to support me in this. And it's late enough, so I'm gonna clock out for now, and hopefully be back on similar time on Thursday evening. And yeah, we'll call it there. Thank you guys for joining in. Talk to you then.